Welcome to Sleep History, where the darkest chapters of power and madness come alive to guide you into peaceful rest. Tonight's journey takes us into the marble halls of Imperial Rome, where absolute power transformed a beloved prince into history's most notorious tyrant. This extended sleep story explores the catastrophic 4-year reign of Gaius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, Little Boots, whose descent into madness nearly destroyed the greatest empire the world had ever known. From his traumatic childhood among the elite of Roman society to his shocking assassination in the tunnels beneath his own palace, discover how unlimited power can corrupt even the most promising leaders. Close your eyes, let the gentle crackle of our Roman brazier transport you to the Forum Romanum and drift into dreams of golden eagles, marble temples, and an emperor who believed himself to be a living god. Sweet dreams await in the shadow of Rome's greatest cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power. Tonight, as you settle into peaceful sleep, imagine the most powerful man on earth slowly losing his mind, while the greatest empire in history watches in horror. Caligula began as Rome's beloved prince, heir to a dynasty that ruled the known world. But power, illness, and paranoia transformed him into something monstrous. A god emperor who declared war on Neptune, made his horse a consul, and turned the Roman Forum into his personal brothel. Let the crackling fire guide us through the rise and catastrophic fall of Rome's most insane ruler. The boy who would become known as Caligula was born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus on August 31st, 12 CE, in the Roman settlement of Antium, what we now call Anzio on the Italian coast. He entered a world where his very bloodline was destiny. The great-grandson of Augustus, the first Roman emperor, and son of Germanicus, Rome's most beloved general. His birth was celebrated throughout the empire as the arrival of a prince who would continue the golden age that had transformed Rome from a republic into the master of the civilized world. But from his earliest days, young Gaius was marked by tragedy and violence that would shape his character in ways no one could predict. His father Germanicus was not just a military hero, but a man of exceptional character. Brilliant, honorable, beloved by his soldiers and the Roman people alike. Germanicus represented everything Romans admired: military genius, personal courage, political wisdom, and unwavering loyalty to the empire. He was the perfect Roman, and Romans naturally assumed his son would follow in his footsteps. Young Gaius spent his early childhood in military camps along the Rhine frontier, where his father commanded the legions defending the empire's northern borders against Germanic tribes. It was here, among the leather tents and campfires of professional soldiers, that the boy acquired the nickname that would follow him to his grave. The legionaries, charmed by the sight of their general's son, dressed in a miniature soldier's uniform, complete with tiny military boots called Caligulae, began calling him Caligula, Little Boots. The nickname was affectionate, born from the soldier's genuine love for both Germanicus and his family. But it also reflected something deeper about Roman military culture and the boy's place within it. From infancy, Gaius was being groomed not just as a future emperor, but as a military commander who would inspire the same devotion in his soldiers that his father commanded. The legions saw him as their mascot, their future leader, the embodiment of Roman military virtue. Life in the military camps was harsh but formative. Young Gaius learned to sleep on campaign beds, to eat soldiers' rations, to march with the legions when they moved from camp to camp. He absorbed the rhythms of military life, the harsh discipline, the absolute hierarchy, the willingness to use violence to achieve political objectives. Most importantly, he learned that soldiers would follow a leader they loved with fanatical devotion, but that such devotion had to be earned through shared hardship and demonstrated courage. But the boy's education was not limited to military matters. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was one of the most intelligent and politically astute women in Rome, a granddaughter of Augustus who understood the complexities of imperial politics better than most senators. She ensured that Gaius received instruction in literature, philosophy, rhetoric, and the subtle arts of political manipulation that were essential for anyone who hoped to survive in the treacherous world of Roman high society. Agrippina also taught her son the most important lesson of imperial survival: that in Rome, power was everything, and those without power were inevitably destroyed by those who possessed it. She had watched Augustus eliminate his rivals through a combination of political skill and ruthless violence. She had seen how Tiberius, Augustus's successor, had consolidated his position by destroying potential threats within his own family. She wanted her son to understand that the Roman Empire was not a fairy tale kingdom, but a violent oligarchy where survival required constant vigilance and occasional brutality. The boy's comfortable world began to collapse in 19 CE when he was just 7 years old. His father, Germanicus, while commanding Roman forces in the east, fell mysteriously ill and died in Antioch. The official cause was given as natural illness, but rumors immediately began circulating that Germanicus had been poisoned on the orders of Emperor Tiberius, who had grown jealous of his nephew's popularity and fearful of his political potential. Whether these rumors were true or not, they were believed by many Romans, including Germanicus's widow and children. Agrippina became convinced that her husband had been murdered and that she and her children were next on Tiberius's list of enemies to be eliminated. This paranoia, whether justified or not, would poison young Gaius's relationship with the imperial system and teach him that even family loyalty could not be trusted when power was at stake. The funeral of Germanicus was one of the most emotionally charged events in Roman history. When his ashes were brought back to Rome, enormous crowds lined the streets to pay their respects to the fallen hero. Agrippina, dressed in mourning clothes and carrying the funeral urn, became a symbol of tragic widowhood that captured the Roman imagination. Behind her walked her children, including 8-year-old Gaius, their faces grave with premature understanding of mortality and political danger. The public grief was genuine and overwhelming, but it also created a political crisis for Emperor Tiberius. The Roman people's mourning for Germanicus became an implicit criticism of the emperor who had allegedly ordered his death. Tiberius found himself in the impossible position of having to honor a man he may have murdered, while managing a population that increasingly saw him as a usurper and tyrant. For young Gaius, his father's funeral was a formative experience that taught him several crucial lessons about Roman politics. He learned that public emotion could be a powerful political weapon, that the Roman people would transfer their loyalty from one leader to another based on personal affection rather than institutional authority, and that dramatic gestures could have more political impact than careful policy. These lessons would later influence his own approach to governance in ways that would prove catastrophic. In the years following Germanicus's death, the political situation for his family became increasingly precarious. Tiberius, never comfortable with the demands of public leadership, began withdrawing from Rome and delegating authority to subordinates who were often corrupt or incompetent. This created a power vacuum that encouraged various ambitious politicians to position themselves as potential successors to the aging emperor. Agrippina, still convinced that Tiberius had murdered her husband, began building a political coalition aimed at securing the throne for one of her sons. This was an extraordinarily dangerous game in a system where political opposition was often considered treason, and treason was punishable by death. But Agrippina was driven by a combination of genuine grief, maternal ambition, and the Roman aristocratic belief that bloodline created entitlement to power. Young Gaius, now in his early teens, watched these political maneuvers with the careful attention of someone whose life depended on their outcome. He learned to read the subtle signs of shifting loyalties among Roman senators, to understand the coded language of political discourse, and to recognize the difference between public statements and private intentions. Most importantly, he learned that in Roman politics, paranoia was often indistinguishable from wisdom. The crisis came to a head in 29 CE, when Tiberius's chief minister Sejanus moved against Agrippina and her supporters. Sejanus had been systematically eliminating potential rivals for imperial succession, and Germanicus's family represented the most serious threat to his ambitions. Using trumped-up charges of treason, he arrested Agrippina and her eldest son Nero, initiating a purge that would destroy most of the remaining descendants of Augustus. 17-year-old Gaius found himself in an impossible position. His mother and brother were in prison facing execution. His remaining siblings were under constant surveillance, and he himself was suspected of disloyalty to the emperor. Any expression of grief for his family's fate could be interpreted as criticism of imperial policy and result in his own arrest and execution. The young man's response to this crisis revealed both his intelligence and the psychological damage that years of trauma and insecurity had inflicted on his developing personality. Rather than attempting to defend his family or challenge Sejanus directly, Gaius adopted a strategy of complete submission to imperial authority, combined with careful cultivation of his own image as a harmless young man interested only in pleasure and entertainment. He threw himself into the pursuits that Romans associated with dissolute youth: chariot racing, gladiatorial games, theatrical performances, and sexual adventures. He cultivated friendships with actors, gladiators, and other figures from Rome's entertainment world who were considered beneath the dignity of serious political figures. Most importantly, he carefully avoided any statements or actions that could be interpreted as political criticism or ambition. This strategy was psychologically devastating, but politically effective. Gaius managed to convince both Tiberius and Sejanus that he represented no threat to their power, while the Roman people began to see him as a victim of imperial tyranny rather than a potential rival to imperial authority. When Sejanus was eventually executed in 31 CE for plotting against Tiberius, Gaius was one of the few members of his family to survive the subsequent purges, but survival came at an enormous psychological cost. Gaius had learned that safety required the complete suppression of his authentic personality, that emotional expression was dangerous, and that power was the only protection against arbitrary violence. He had also learned that the Roman people's love could be fickle, transferring from heroes to villains based on political circumstances rather than personal merit. In 31 CE, at age 19, Gaius was summoned to join Emperor Tiberius on the island of Capri, where the aging ruler had retreated from the demands of governing the empire. This invitation was both an honor and a trap. It demonstrated imperial favor, but also placed the young man under constant surveillance by an emperor who trusted no one and suspected everyone of plotting against him. Life on Capri was unlike anything Gaius had experienced. The island had been transformed into a pleasure palace, where the emperor indulged in increasingly bizarre sexual fantasies while governing the empire through a network of spies and informants. Tiberius, now in his 70s, had become a paranoid recluse who saw enemies everywhere and responded to imagined threats with sudden, brutal violence. For 6 years, Gaius lived in this strange environment, serving as companion to an emperor who alternated between paternal affection and homicidal suspicion. He learned to navigate the treacherous currents of Tiberius's moods, to anticipate the old man's needs and fears, and to make himself indispensable without appearing ambitious. It was a masterclass in political survival that would later inform his own approach to wielding power. But the experience also completed the psychological transformation, that had begun with his father's death and his family's destruction. Living in constant fear of execution, surrounded by luxury but denied genuine human connection, required to participate in or witness acts of cruelty and depravity, Gaius developed the emotional armor that would later make him capable of extraordinary brutality toward others. When Tiberius finally died in 37 CE, possibly smothered by Gaius himself, according to some accounts, the 25-year-old heir was proclaimed emperor by the Praetorian Guard with the enthusiastic support of the Roman people. After years of rule by a paranoid recluse, Romans were eager to embrace a young emperor who represented a return to the golden age of Augustus and the military glory of Germanicus. The transformation from Gaius to Caligula was about to begin, and with it, the most catastrophic 4 years in Roman imperial history. The morning of March 16th, 37 CE dawned bright and clear over Rome as news spread through the city's crowded streets. Tiberius was dead, and young Gaius Caesar had been proclaimed emperor by the Praetorian Guard. From the poorest insulae in the Subura to the marble villas on the Palatine Hill, Romans poured into the streets to celebrate the beginning of what they believed would be a new golden age. The crowds that gathered in the Forum Romanum that day were unlike anything seen since the funeral of Augustus, nearly a quarter century earlier. Veterans of the Germanic wars carried images of Germanicus alongside portraits of his son. Senators who had lived in fear under Tiberius's suspicious reign embraced each other openly, tears streaming down their faces as they contemplated the end of their long nightmare. Common citizens threw flowers and shouted themselves hoarse, proclaiming their love for the grandson of their beloved Germanicus. For the first time in decades, Rome felt unified in hope rather than divided by fear. The young emperor they cheered represented everything they wanted in a leader: the bloodline of Augustus, the military heritage of Germanicus, the vigor of youth, and the promise of a return to the values that had made Rome great. As Gaius made his way through the cheering crowds toward the Senate House where he would formally assume power, he seemed to embody the restoration of Roman virtue after years of decline. The Senate's confirmation of Gaius as emperor was a mere formality, but the ceremony itself was designed to demonstrate the dramatic change in imperial style that his accession represented. Where Tiberius had been remote and suspicious, Gaius was accessible and trusting. Where the old emperor had governed through fear and intrigue, the young one promised to rule through love and openness. Most importantly, where Tiberius had treated the Senate as a collection of potential enemies, Gaius proclaimed his respect for the ancient traditions of republican government. His inaugural speech to the Senate was a masterpiece of political theatre that demonstrated the rhetorical skills he had learned during his years of carefully observed survival. He praised the wisdom of the senators, promised to respect their traditional privileges, and committed himself to governing in partnership with Rome's most distinguished families, rather than as an autocratic dictator. He specifically repudiated the paranoid suspicions that had characterized Tiberius's reign, declaring that he would judge men by their actions rather than their alleged thoughts. But the speech also contained subtle hints of the grandiosity that would later characterize his reign. Gaius spoke of his divine ancestry through Augustus, his heroic bloodline through Germanicus, and his sacred duty to restore Rome to its destined position as master of the world. These themes were conventional enough in imperial rhetoric, but there was an intensity in his delivery that suggested he took such claims more seriously than political convention required. The new emperor's first acts were calculated to demonstrate his break with the policies and practices of his predecessor. He recalled political exiles, released prisoners who had been held on dubious charges, and restored property that had been confiscated during Tiberius's purges. Most dramatically, he arranged elaborate public funerals for his mother, Agrippina, and his brothers, ceremonies that served both to honor his family's memory and to remind Romans of the injustices they had suffered under the previous regime. These gestures were enormously popular with the Roman people, who saw them as evidence that their new emperor valued justice over political expediency. But they also served Gaius's psychological needs by allowing him to publicly grieve for losses that he had been forced to suppress for years. The elaborate ceremonies surrounding his family's posthumous honors were not just political theater, but genuine expressions of emotions that had been dangerous to display during Tiberius's reign. The emperor's generosity extended beyond symbolic gestures to concrete benefits for various segments of Roman society. He distributed cash bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, the urban cohorts, and the legions stationed throughout the empire, ensuring military loyalty while demonstrating his appreciation for the armed forces that had made his accession possible. He organized lavish public games and spectacles that provided entertainment for the masses, while displaying the wealth and power of the imperial household. Most popular of all were his construction projects, which provided employment for thousands of workers, while creating monuments that would serve as permanent reminders of his reign. He completed buildings that Tiberius had left unfinished, began new temples and theatres, and expanded the harbour facilities at Puteoli to improve grain shipments from Egypt. These projects demonstrated both his commitment to public welfare and his understanding of the importance of maintaining popular support through visible acts of imperial largesse. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Gaius's early reign was his transformation of the imperial court. From the paranoid isolation that had characterized Tiberius's final years to an open and accessible center of Roman social life. He moved the court back to Rome from Capri, reopened the imperial palace to visitors, and began hosting elaborate banquets and ceremonies that included senators, equestrians, and even prominent freedmen. These gatherings were not merely social events, but carefully orchestrated displays of imperial magnificence designed to reinforce Gaius's position as the natural center of Roman society. Guests were required to follow elaborate protocols that emphasized the emperor's elevated status while appearing to honor their own dignity. The ceremonies combined republican traditions with monarchical innovations in ways that gradually accustomed Roman elites to accepting levels of imperial authority that would have been unthinkable under Augustus. The emperor's personal behavior during this period was calculated to project an image of youth, vigor, and accessibility that contrasted sharply with memories of Tiberius's gloomy reclusiveness. Gaius appeared regularly at gladiatorial games and chariot races, cheering enthusiastically for his favorite competitors and distributing prizes with generous enthusiasm. He attended theatrical performances, participated in religious ceremonies, and made himself visible throughout Rome in ways that encouraged ordinary citizens to feel a personal connection to their ruler. But even during this honeymoon period, careful observers noted troubling aspects of the new emperor's personality and behavior. His generosity, while popular, was being funded by spending down the enormous treasury surplus that Tiberius had accumulated through years of fiscal restraint. His construction projects, while impressive, were designed more for grandeur than utility. Most concerning, his court ceremonies were gradually becoming more elaborate and more focused on imperial glorification than republican tradition might have warranted. More subtly, those who had opportunities to observe Gaius closely began noticing psychological quirks that suggested his years of trauma and enforced dissimulation had left deeper scars than his public persona revealed. He seemed unable to tolerate criticism or contradiction, even when offered respectfully by experienced advisors. He displayed an obsessive attention to protocol and precedents that suggested deep insecurity about his own authority. Most disturbingly, he appeared to derive unusual pleasure from the fear and discomfort of others, even when such emotions were unintentional. The emperor's relationship with his sisters also attracted attention from court observers, who were trained to read political significance into personal relationships. Gaius had 3 sisters, Agrippina the Younger, Drusilla, and Livilla, who had survived the purges that destroyed most of their family during Tiberius's reign. His affection for them was genuine and touching, but it was also excessive in ways that raised eyebrows among senators who were familiar with the complex dynamics of imperial families. Most controversial was his relationship with Drusilla, who was not only his favourite sister, but apparently his lover as well. Incestuous relationships were not unknown among Roman aristocratic families, but they were generally conducted with discretion and rarely acknowledged publicly. Gaius, however, seemed to take pleasure in flaunting his sexual relationship with Drusilla in ways that both scandalized traditional Romans and demonstrated his indifference to conventional moral standards. The emperor's sexual behavior more generally was becoming a source of concern among those responsible for maintaining the dignity of the imperial office. His affairs with married women were conducted with little attempt at concealment, while his relationships with actors, gladiators, and other socially marginal figures violated traditional boundaries between the imperial household and Rome's entertainment underworld. These liaisons were not necessarily more scandalous than those of previous emperors, but they were more public and more obviously designed to shock and provoke. By the end of his first year in power, Gaius had succeeded in establishing himself as a popular and effective emperor who had restored confidence in the imperial system after the trauma of Tiberius's final years. The treasury was still solvent, the provinces were peaceful, the military was loyal, and the Roman people were content with their young ruler's performance. But the psychological foundations for his later descent into madness and tyranny were already in place, visible to those who knew how to read the signs. The emperor, who had learned to survive through careful dissimulation and strategic submission, was beginning to discover that he no longer needed to dissimulate or submit to anyone. The young man who had lived in constant fear of arbitrary execution was now in a position to inflict arbitrary execution on others. Most dangerously, the prince who had been forced to suppress his authentic personality for years was beginning to explore what that authentic personality might be when freed from all external constraints. The honeymoon period was drawing to a close, and the emergence of Caligula was about to begin. The transformation began with an illness. In October of 38 CE, just 8 months into his reign, Emperor Gaius fell desperately sick with a mysterious malady that brought him to death's door. For days, he lay unconscious in the imperial palace while the empire held its breath. Senators offered sacrifices to the gods. Common citizens gathered in the forum to pray for their beloved emperor's recovery. And the Praetorian Guard maintained a vigilant watch against any attempt to exploit the crisis for political gain. But when Gaius finally emerged from his delirium, something fundamental had changed. The charming young emperor who had won the hearts of the Roman people was gone, replaced by something darker and more dangerous. Whether the illness had caused physical damage to his brain, triggered a psychological breakdown rooted in his traumatic childhood, or simply provided an excuse to abandon the exhausting performance of being a beloved ruler, the man who recovered was no longer the same person who had fallen ill. The first signs of change were subtle, visible only to those who had daily contact with the emperor. His mood swings became more extreme and unpredictable, shifting from euphoric generosity to cold fury without apparent cause. His treatment of servants and subordinates grew capricious, alternating between excessive familiarity and sudden brutal punishment. Most disturbing to experienced courtiers, he began speaking of himself in terms that suggested he no longer saw himself as merely human. The emperor's recovery was celebrated throughout Rome with public games and religious ceremonies, but those closest to him noticed that his participation in these events had taken on a different character. Where he had previously seemed to enjoy the crowd's adoration as a natural expression of their affection, he now appeared to regard it as his divine due. He began requiring more elaborate protocols for audiences, insisting on forms of address that bordered on worship, and displaying irritation when traditional republican courtesies failed to acknowledge his elevated status adequately. His relationship with the Senate, which had been cordial and respectful during his first months in power, began to deteriorate as he demonstrated increasing impatience with their deliberative procedures and traditional prerogatives. Senators who had welcomed his promises to govern in partnership with Rome's ancient institutions found themselves dealing with an emperor who seemed to view their discussions as tiresome obstacles to his will, rather than valuable contributions to imperial policy. The change was most dramatically visible in his treatment of religious matters. Roman emperors had always held the position of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the state religion, but this had traditionally been understood as an administrative role that required respectful attention to religious tradition rather than personal divine authority. Gaius, however, began asserting that his imperial position granted him not just religious authority, but actual divine status that placed him above the traditional gods of Rome. This theological innovation was not merely academic, but had immediate practical implications for anyone who came into contact with the emperor. He began requiring that people approach him with the same rituals used in worshipping gods, including prostration, offerings, and forms of address that acknowledged his divinity. Those who failed to demonstrate adequate reverence faced punishment that could range from public humiliation to execution, depending on the emperor's mood and their political importance. The emperor's divine pretensions were perhaps most clearly demonstrated in his treatment of his deceased sister Drusilla, who had died suddenly in June of 38 CE during his illness. Gaius not only deified her posthumously, an honor previously reserved for emperors and their wives, but established a religious cult in her honor that required senators and other officials to participate in her worship. The ceremonies were elaborate and expensive, but they also served the political purpose of forcing Roman elites to publicly acknowledge the emperor's authority to create new gods and rewrite religious tradition. His behavior toward his surviving sisters, Agrippina and Livilla, became equally problematic, but in different ways. Where his relationship with Drusilla had been scandalously intimate, his treatment of his other sisters oscillated between excessive favoritism and sudden, inexplicable hostility. He would shower them with honors and privileges one day, then subject them to public humiliation the next, apparently depending on his perception of their loyalty and submission to his divine authority. These personal relationships were closely watched by Roman society because they provided clues about how the emperor might treat other members of the elite. If he could not maintain stable, predictable relationships with his own family members, what hope was there for senators, generals, or provincial governors who had far less claim on his affection? The arbitrary nature of his favoritism created an atmosphere of constant anxiety among those whose positions required regular contact with the imperial court. The emperor's fiscal policies during this period also began reflecting his changing personality and priorities. The generous spending that had characterized his early reign continued, but it was increasingly directed toward projects that served his personal glorification rather than public utility. He began construction of enormous statues of himself, elaborate temples dedicated to his worship, and palatial additions to imperial residences that exceeded anything seen in previous reigns. Most spectacular was his decision to extend the imperial palace complex across the Forum Romanum to the Temple of Castor and Pollux, which he converted into a personal shrine where Romans could worship him directly. This project required enormous expense and considerable disruption to the normal functioning of the city, but it served the crucial purpose of physically demonstrating his elevation above ordinary human status while providing a permanent venue for the imperial cult. The emperor's military policies during this period revealed the same combination of grandiosity and impracticality that characterized his other initiatives. He began planning campaigns that seemed designed more to enhance his personal glory than to serve strategic imperial interests. Most notably, he announced his intention to invade Britain, a project that would require enormous resources and offer questionable benefits, but that would associate his name with the conquest of territories that even Julius Caesar had not permanently subdued. But it was his treatment of individual senators and other prominent Romans that most clearly demonstrated the dangerous direction of his reign. He began using his authority to humiliate and terrorize members of the elite in ways that served no apparent political purpose beyond demonstrating his absolute power over their lives and dignity. Senators were required to run alongside his chariot during public processions, to serve as waiters at imperial banquets, and to participate in degrading ceremonies that mocked their traditional status and authority. These humiliations were not random acts of cruelty, but carefully calculated demonstrations of the emperor's authority to redefine social hierarchy and political relationships according to his personal whims. By forcing senators to accept degrading treatment without protest, he was establishing the principle that traditional Roman concepts of dignity and status were subordinate to imperial will. Those who submitted demonstrated their acceptance of the new order. Those who resisted could be eliminated as enemies of the state. The emperor's sexuality also became increasingly public and increasingly transgressive during this period. His affairs with married women were now conducted with deliberate publicity designed to humiliate their husbands and demonstrate his authority over the most intimate aspects of Roman family life. He began auctioning off the wives and daughters of prominent citizens as a form of entertainment at imperial banquets, forcing their male relatives to bid against each other for the privilege of preventing their family's dishonor. More shocking still were his relationships with men, particularly those of high social standing. Roman culture was relatively tolerant of male homosexuality, but it was expected to follow certain protocols that preserved the dignity of freeborn citizens. Gaius ignored these conventions entirely, publicly flaunting relationships that violated traditional concepts of masculine honor and social propriety. His partners were chosen not for personal affection, but for their political prominence, making sexual submission another tool for demonstrating imperial dominance. By the end of 39 CE, the emperor's behavior had become so erratic and threatening that even his closest supporters began to question his fitness for rule. The treasury surplus that Tiberius had accumulated was rapidly being depleted by imperial extravagance, while the emperor's demands for divine honors were creating religious and constitutional crises that threatened the stability of traditional Roman institutions. Most ominously, his treatment of potential rivals within the imperial family suggested that he was beginning to view his own relatives as threats to be eliminated rather than allies to be cultivated. His sisters were subjected to increasing surveillance and restriction, while other members of the Julio-Claudian dynasty found themselves under suspicion for imaginary plots against imperial authority. The man who had been hailed as Rome's salvation was revealing himself to be something far more dangerous. An emperor who believed himself to be a god, and who was prepared to use the full machinery of imperial power to force his subjects to acknowledge his divinity. The honeymoon was over, and the nightmare was about to begin. The year 39 CE marked the point of no return in Caligula's transformation, from beloved emperor to despotic madman. The signs had been accumulating for months, but it was during this period that his behavior crossed the line from eccentricity into outright insanity, creating a reign of terror that would haunt Roman memory for generations. The catalyst was a conspiracy that may or may not have actually existed. In late 39 CE, Gaius became convinced that his brother-in-law, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, was plotting against him in collaboration with his sisters Agrippina and Livilla. Whether this conspiracy was real or a product of the emperor's increasingly paranoid imagination remains unclear, but his response was swift, brutal, and disproportionate. Lepidus was arrested, tortured, and executed without trial, his body displayed in the forum as a warning to other potential conspirators. But the emperor's vengeance did not stop there. Agrippina and Livilla, the sisters he had once cherished above all others, were stripped of their honours, exiled to remote islands, and forced to carry their brother's ashes back to Rome in funeral urns, a grotesque parody of their mother's famous journey with Germanicus's remains decades earlier. The destruction of his own family marked a psychological watershed for Gaius. If he could not trust his sisters, whom he had loved with an intensity that bordered on the erotic, then he could trust no one. The emperor, who had once delighted in the company of others, began withdrawing into a paranoid isolation that made Tiberius's final years seem sociable by comparison. But where Tiberius had responded to isolation by retreating from public life, Gaius reacted by becoming increasingly demanding of public attention and adoration. Unable to form genuine human connections, he sought to replace authentic relationships with the artificial worship of terrified subjects. The emperor who could not inspire love would instead command fear, and through fear, he would extract the submission that his damaged psyche required. His divine pretensions, which had begun as minor eccentricities, now became the central organizing principle of his reign. He ordered the construction of a temple dedicated to himself in the Campus Martius, staffed by priests whose only function was to offer daily sacrifices for his health and prosperity. He required senators to take oaths not just of political loyalty, but of religious devotion, swearing by his divinity in the same formulas used for traditional gods. Most shocking of all, he began appearing in public dressed as various deities, claiming that he was not merely emperor of Rome, but the earthly incarnation of Jupiter, Mars, Apollo, or whichever god suited his mood on any particular day. These appearances were elaborate theatrical productions that required extensive preparation and enormous expense, but they served the crucial psychological function of reinforcing his belief in his own supernatural status. The emperor's relationship with the traditional gods of Rome became increasingly competitive and hostile. He ordered the removal of statues of famous gods from their temples, replacing them with images of himself. He claimed that Jupiter had acknowledged his superiority and abdicated in his favor. Most blasphemously, he began holding conversations with the statue of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, sometimes shouting angrily at the image when it failed to respond to his questions or demands. These theological innovations were not merely personal quirks, but had immediate practical consequences for anyone involved in Roman religious life. Priests who failed to show adequate enthusiasm for the imperial cult faced removal from their positions, or worse. Citizens who continued to worship traditional gods without acknowledging the emperor's divinity could be charged with impiety or treason. The entire religious framework that had sustained Roman society for centuries was being systematically dismantled and replaced with the worship of a living man who claimed divine status. The emperor's military adventures during this period reflected the same combination of grandiosity and incompetence that characterized his other initiatives. His planned invasion of Britain was launched with enormous fanfare, but ended in farce when the emperor, having marched his legions to the English Channel, apparently lost his nerve and ordered his soldiers to collect seashells as spoils of the sea instead of attempting an actual crossing. This bizarre incident, which became a source of ridicule throughout the empire, demonstrated both the emperor's detachment from military reality and his inability to accept the limitations that geography and logistics imposed on even divine rulers. His subsequent claim that he had defeated Neptune himself and forced the sea god to surrender his treasures was met with barely concealed laughter from veterans who had served under competent commanders. Even more destructive was his treatment of the Rhine legions, the forces that had known him as a child and had given him his nickname. When he visited the Germanic frontier in 39 CE, instead of the warm reception he expected, he encountered soldiers who were embarrassed by their former mascot's transformation into a megalomaniacal tyrant. His response was to order decimation, the execution of every 10th man, for units that failed to demonstrate adequate enthusiasm for his presence. This punishment was not only militarily counterproductive, but politically disastrous, as it destroyed the personal loyalty that had been one of his few remaining sources of genuine support. The legions that had once celebrated little boots now regarded Caligula as a dangerous madman who would sacrifice their lives for his personal gratification without regard for military necessity or strategic value. The emperor's fiscal policies during this period were equally catastrophic. His construction projects, religious innovations, and military adventures were consuming the imperial treasury at an unprecedented rate, while his demands for divine honors required constant tribute from provincial communities that were already struggling with tax burdens. Within 2 years of his accession, he had transformed Tiberius's enormous fiscal surplus into a looming budget crisis that threatened the basic functioning of imperial government. His response to this financial emergency revealed both his detachment from economic reality and his willingness to exploit his subjects in increasingly creative ways. Instead of reducing expenditures or implementing sensible revenue measures, he began confiscating property from wealthy Romans on trumped-up charges of treason or impiety. Senators who had inherited fortunes built over generations found themselves stripped of their wealth overnight. Their estates auctioned off to fund the emperor's latest construction project or religious ceremony. Even more destructive was his innovation in taxation policy. He began imposing levies on activities that had never been taxed before: lawsuits, marriages, divorces, even conversations held in public places. Citizens were required to pay fees for the privilege of approaching the emperor, for having their cases heard in imperial courts, and for participating in religious ceremonies that he deemed necessary for their spiritual welfare. Most cynically, he began auctioning off gladiators, condemned criminals, and even ordinary citizens as a form of imperial entertainment that also generated revenue. These auctions were held during public games, with the emperor serving as auctioneer while forcing prominent Romans to bid against each other for human beings whose lives and deaths had become commodities in the imperial economy. The psychological impact of these policies on Roman society was profound and lasting. Citizens who had once taken pride in their legal protections and civic rights found themselves living in a world where imperial whim could strip them of property, family, and life itself without warning or appeal. The predictable legal framework that had made Roman civilization possible was being replaced by the arbitrary will of a ruler who acknowledged no constraints on his authority except his own imagination. The emperor's treatment of his household staff and palace servants during this period provided a daily demonstration of his capacity for casual cruelty. Slaves who displeased him were subjected to tortures that served no disciplinary purpose beyond his own amusement. Freedmen who had served the imperial family faithfully for decades were suddenly executed for imaginary offences, their deaths designed to reinforce the message that even the longest record of loyal service provided no protection against imperial displeasure. Most disturbing was his treatment of his food tasters, men whose job required them to risk their lives daily to protect the emperor from poisoning. Gaius began deliberately serving them food that he knew was contaminated, apparently finding it amusing to watch them suffer the symptoms of various toxins while he decided whether to provide antidotes. These incidents served no security purpose, but satisfied his growing need to exercise power over life and death in increasingly intimate and personal ways. His sexual behavior during this period became so extreme that even Roman society, which was relatively tolerant of imperial excess, began to recoil in horror. He established a brothel in the imperial palace, where senators' wives and daughters were forced to serve as prostitutes, with their earnings going directly to the imperial treasury. The husbands and fathers of these women were required to attend these establishments as customers, creating scenarios of humiliation that destroyed family relationships while demonstrating the emperor's absolute authority over the most intimate aspects of Roman life. The emperor's marriage to Lollia Paulina in 38 CE had lasted only a few months before he divorced her for alleged adultery and forbade her from ever remarrying. His subsequent marriage to Milonia Caesonia was equally troubled, though it lasted longer due to her apparent willingness to participate in his increasingly bizarre sexual fantasies and religious ceremonies. Caesonia's influence over the emperor was significant, but ultimately destructive, as she encouraged his delusions of divinity while participating in orgies and religious ceremonies that scandalized even the most sophisticated Romans. Their daughter, born in 39 CE, was proclaimed divine from birth and given honors traditionally reserved for adult members of the imperial family, creating a succession crisis that added political instability to the emperor's other failures. The birth of his daughter seemed to trigger a new phase in Gaius's madness, as he became obsessed with the idea that his divine bloodline required special protection from earthly contamination. He began requiring elaborate purification rituals for anyone who came into contact with the child, while claiming that her divine nature was already manifesting itself through supernatural signs and portents that only he could interpret. His relationship with the Senate during this period descended into open contempt and mutual hostility. Senators who had initially welcomed his promises of partnership found themselves treated as servants, whose only function was to applaud his speeches and approve his increasingly outrageous demands. He began holding Senate meetings in his private chambers, forcing elderly senators to stand for hours while he reclined on a couch, occasionally interrupting their deliberations to share intimate details of his sexual adventures or divine revelations. Most humiliating was his practice of requiring senators to worship him before conducting any official business, prostrating themselves before his throne while reciting prayers that acknowledged his divinity and their own unworthiness. Those who performed these rituals with insufficient enthusiasm faced immediate punishment, while those who refused were charged with treason and executed as enemies of the state. The emperor's treatment of foreign ambassadors and provincial delegations created diplomatic crises throughout the empire as allied kingdoms and tributary states struggled to understand how to deal with a ruler who seemed to have abandoned all conventional approaches to international relations. Ambassadors who had come to Rome expecting traditional diplomatic protocols found themselves required to participate in religious ceremonies that violated their own cultural and religious traditions. Most problematic was his treatment of Jewish delegations, who faced an impossible choice between acknowledging his divinity, which violated their fundamental religious beliefs, and risking punishment for impiety. His demand that a statue of himself be placed in the temple in Jerusalem nearly triggered a full-scale revolt in Judea, averted only by the intervention of officials who understood the catastrophic consequences such an action would have for imperial control over the eastern provinces. By the end of 40 CE, the emperor's behavior had become so erratic and destructive that even his closest supporters began to question his fitness for continued rule. The financial crisis was approaching the point where the government might be unable to pay the salaries of the Praetorian Guard and the legions, while his religious innovations had created constitutional conflicts that threatened the basic legitimacy of imperial authority. Most ominously, his paranoid suspicions were beginning to focus on the very people whose loyalty was essential for his survival. He had already destroyed his relationship with his sisters and eliminated potential rivals within the imperial family. Now, he was beginning to view his own guards, advisors, and administrators as potential threats who might need to be eliminated before they could move against him. The spiral into complete madness was accelerating, and the end of Caligula's reign was becoming not a question of if, but when. By the winter of 40 CE, the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill had been transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to Augustus, or even Tiberius. What had once been the administrative center of the world's greatest empire had become a theater of horrors, where the emperor's increasingly deranged fantasies were acted out with the full resources of the Roman state. The palace corridors, once filled with senators, diplomats, and administrative officials conducting the serious business of governing an empire, now echoed with screams of terror and forced laughter, as Caligula staged elaborate entertainments that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. Rooms that had once housed libraries and government offices were converted into torture chambers, improvised theatres, and shrines dedicated to the emperor's worship. The transformation was not merely physical, but psychological, as everyone who entered the palace understood that they were crossing the threshold into a world where normal human relationships and social conventions had been suspended in favor of the emperor's will. Senators, who had once debated policy with dignity, found themselves performing as actors in obscene comedies scripted by their imperial director. Military commanders, who had conquered provinces for Rome, discovered that their new primary duty was to participate in religious ceremonies celebrating their emperor's divinity. Most disturbing was the emperor's practice of holding what he called divine audiences, elaborate ceremonies where he received petitioners while dressed as different gods and surrounded by the theatrical props appropriate to his chosen divine persona. Supplicants never knew whether they would find him incarnated as Jupiter, complete with thunderbolt and eagle, or as Bacchus, surrounded by wine cups and dancing girls, or as Mars, wearing military regalia and demanding blood sacrifices. These audiences were not merely theatrical performances, but served the practical function of reinforcing the emperor's divine status, while creating opportunities for him to demonstrate his arbitrary power over his subjects' lives. A petitioner who failed to show adequate reverence for the emperor's divine persona might find himself sentenced to immediate execution, while one who performed the required rituals with sufficient enthusiasm might receive rewards far beyond what his request merited. The emperor's daily routine had become a carefully choreographed sequence of divine activities that required the participation of hundreds of courtiers, servants, and officials. His morning awakening was treated as a divine epiphany, with priests offering sacrifices and singing hymns while he emerged from his bedchamber. His meals were sacred banquets where every dish was blessed and every cup of wine was treated as a religious libation. Even his bodily functions became matters of religious significance. His urine and feces were collected by specially appointed priests and preserved as sacred relics, while his breath was said to contain divine essence that could heal the sick or curse the wicked. Courtiers competed for the privilege of sharing in these intimate divine mysteries, understanding that proximity to the emperor's person was their only protection against his increasingly unpredictable wrath. The emperor's relationship with his wife Caesonia during this period revealed both his capacity for genuine affection and his inability to maintain normal human relationships, even with those he claimed to love. He would alternate between treating her as a fellow divinity deserving of worship and as a possession whose value depended entirely on her usefulness in fulfilling his fantasies and validating his delusions. The emperor's public appearances became increasingly rare and increasingly disturbing when they occurred. Instead of the accessible, charming young ruler who had once delighted in mixing with ordinary Romans, citizens now encountered a figure who seemed to belong to a different species entirely, elaborately costumed, surrounded by armed guards, speaking in the obscure language of divine revelation rather than the straightforward communication that Romans expected from their leaders. By late 40 CE, even the emperor's personal servants and closest advisors were beginning to understand that his reign was approaching a crisis that could only end in catastrophe. The financial resources of the empire were being exhausted. The loyalty of the military was being destroyed. and the basic institutions of Roman government were being dismantled in favor of the emperor's personal cult. Most immediately threatening was the emperor's growing paranoia about potential conspiracies, which had reached the point where he suspected treachery in every conversation and saw enemies in every shadow. His response to these imagined threats was to order preemptive executions of anyone whose loyalty seemed questionable, creating a reign of terror that was destroying the very people whose support he needed to maintain his position. The palace that had once been the symbol of Roman order and authority had become a madhouse, where the emperor's delusions were given deadly reality through the mechanisms of imperial power. The man who had begun his reign as Rome's salvation was revealing himself to be its greatest threat, and those closest to him were beginning to understand that their own survival might depend on ending his reign before he destroyed them all. The conspirators met in hushed whispers throughout the palace during the cold January nights of 41 CE, their conversations carefully disguised as routine administrative discussions, while their eyes constantly scanned for the emperor's network of spies and informants. At the center of the plot was Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard, whose military career had been distinguished by courage and competence until Caligula's taunts about his supposed effeminacy had made his life a daily humiliation. Chaerea was not motivated by personal ambition or political ideology, but by the professional soldier's understanding that the emperor had become a threat to the empire's survival that could only be eliminated through decisive action. He had watched in horror as Caligula systematically destroyed the military discipline and institutional loyalty that were the foundations of Roman power, replacing them with a cult of personality that demanded worship rather than respect. The tribune's fellow conspirators represented a cross-section of Roman society, united only by their shared recognition that Caligula's reign had become incompatible with the survival of Roman civilization. Marcus Vinicius, the emperor's brother-in-law, brought the perspective of the old republican families who saw the imperial system as a necessary evil that had been perverted into something monstrous. Cornelius Sabinus and other Praetorian officers contributed their understanding of palace security and their access to the emperor's daily routine. Perhaps most significantly, the conspiracy included Callistus, Narcissus, and other powerful freedmen who controlled much of the imperial administration. These men understood, better than anyone, the practical damage that Caligula's policies were inflicting on the machinery of government, and they possessed the detailed knowledge of palace operations that would be essential for any successful assassination attempt. The conspirators' initial challenge was timing. The emperor's schedule had become increasingly erratic as his paranoia deepened, making it difficult to predict when and where he might be vulnerable to attack. His public appearances were heavily guarded and carefully controlled, while his private activities were shielded by layers of security that made unauthorized access nearly impossible. The opportunity came during the Palatine Games, a religious festival that Caligula had expanded into a 4-day celebration of his divine status. The emperor, despite his growing fears of assassination, could not resist the opportunity to display himself before large crowds while receiving the worship that his damaged psyche required. The games provided cover for unusual movement throughout the palace, while creating distractions that would mask the conspirators' preparations. On the morning of January 24th, 41 CE, the emperor awoke in an unusually cheerful mood, apparently convinced that recent omens had confirmed his divine protection and guaranteed his safety from earthly threats. He spent the morning in his private theatre, watching rehearsals for a pantomime that he had commissioned to celebrate his victory over Neptune and his conquest of the sea's treasures. The performance was typical of the entertainments that had replaced serious government business during the final phase of his reign. Elaborate, expensive, and focused entirely on glorifying the emperor's supposed achievements. Actors dressed as sea nymphs danced around a figure representing Neptune while singing hymns that proclaimed Caligula's superiority to the traditional gods of Rome. Cassius Chaerea approached the emperor during a break in the rehearsal, ostensibly to request the day's watchword, according to standard military protocol. This daily ritual had become another opportunity for Caligula to humiliate his guards by assigning passwords with effeminate or sexual connotations that mocked their martial dignity. The emperor, in high spirits from the morning's entertainment, assigned the password Jupiter, an ironic choice that would be remembered as his final assertion of divine status. The assassination took place in a narrow underground passage that connected the theatre to the palace proper, a location that the conspirators had chosen for its isolation and its symbolic significance as a space between the public performance of imperial power and the private reality of the emperor's living quarters. As Caligula walked through the corridor, accompanied by a small escort, Chaerea struck the first blow with his sword while shouting, "Take this!" a phrase that resonated with Republican overtones of tyrannicide. The emperor's initial reaction was reportedly one of genuine surprise rather than fear, as if he could not comprehend that anyone would dare to attack a living god. He cried out, "I still live!" even as the other conspirators joined the attack, their swords and daggers finding their mark while palace servants fled in terror. The man who had claimed divine status died like any mortal, his blood pooling on the marble floor, while his assassin stood over his body with the grim satisfaction of soldiers who had completed a necessary but distasteful mission. The immediate aftermath of the assassination revealed both the depth of hatred that Caligula had inspired and the institutional chaos that his reign had created. Palace guards who discovered the emperor's body did not attempt to pursue his killers, but instead began celebrating their liberation from a tyrant who had made their lives miserable. Servants and administrators who had lived in constant fear of arbitrary execution emerged from their hiding places with expressions of relief and gratitude toward the conspirators. But the conspiracy had been planned as an act of elimination rather than succession, and the assassins found themselves facing the immediate problem of who would replace the dead emperor. Their initial plan had been to restore the Roman Republic, but this proved politically impossible when they discovered that the Praetorian Guard was already moving to install Claudius, Caligula's uncle, as the new emperor. Claudius had been found hiding behind a curtain in the palace, apparently terrified that he would be killed along with his nephew as part of a general purge of the imperial family. His elevation to the purple was as much an accident as a political choice, but it served the crucial function of maintaining imperial continuity while preventing the civil war that might have erupted if the throne had remained vacant. The new emperor's first acts were designed to demonstrate the dramatic change in imperial policy that Caligula's death represented. He recalled political exiles, restored confiscated property, and disbanded the religious cult that had centered on his predecessor's worship. Most symbolically, he ordered the destruction of the statues and temples that Caligula had erected to himself, returning the sacred spaces of Rome to their traditional religious functions. The Senate's official response to Caligula's assassination was carefully crafted to balance relief at his death, with concern about the precedent that his murder established for future imperial succession. The formal decree condemned his tyranny while praising the courage of those who had liberated Rome from his rule. But it also emphasized the importance of maintaining imperial institutions under more suitable leadership. Popular reaction in Rome was overwhelmingly positive, with crowds gathering in the streets to celebrate the end of a reign that had brought them poverty, humiliation, and constant fear. The gladiatorial games and public spectacles that had been suspended due to fiscal crisis were quickly restored, while the grain distributions that fed the urban masses were reorganized to ensure adequate supplies for the coming months. Throughout the provinces, news of Caligula's death was greeted with similar relief by populations that had suffered under his taxation policies and religious demands. Provincial governors reported that their territories were returning to normal patterns of administration and taxation. while local communities began rebuilding the traditional temples and civic institutions that had been disrupted by requirements for imperial worship. But the deeper damage that Caligula had inflicted on Roman institutions and Roman psychology could not be repaired so easily. His reign had demonstrated that the imperial system, for all its benefits in terms of order and prosperity, contained within itself the potential for catastrophic abuse of power. The same mechanisms that had enabled Augustus to create peace and stability throughout the Mediterranean world had allowed his descendant to terrorize and humiliate that world's most powerful citizens. The precedent of imperial assassination would haunt subsequent emperors, who understood that their own survival depended not only on military success and popular support, but on maintaining the loyalty of the very guards who were responsible for their protection. The Praetorian Guard's role in both Caligula's death and Claudius's elevation established their position as kingmakers, whose approval was essential for imperial legitimacy. Perhaps most significantly, Caligula's reign had revealed the fundamental instability of a political system that concentrated unlimited power in the hands of a single individual, without providing effective checks against the abuse of that power. The Roman Empire would survive for centuries after his death, but it would never again enjoy the confident optimism that had characterized the early imperial period under Augustus and Tiberius. The man who had begun his reign as Rome's beloved little boots died unmourned and unlamented, his body hastily cremated and his ashes scattered without ceremony. His name was officially condemned by the Senate. His statues were destroyed, and his achievements were erased from public monuments in an attempt to obliterate his memory from Roman history. But Caligula's legacy could not be so easily eliminated. His reign had shown that absolute power inevitably corrupts even those who seem destined for greatness, that institutional safeguards mean nothing when confronted by determined tyranny, and that the price of political stability is eternal vigilance against those who would exploit that stability for their own twisted purposes. As you drift into peaceful sleep tonight, remember that power without accountability is the greatest threat to human dignity and freedom. The marble halls of imperial Rome may be silent now, but the lessons of Caligula's reign echo through every age and every society, where individuals are granted authority over their fellow human beings. The emperor, who believed himself to be a god, discovered that even gods can die. But the more important truth is that power itself is mortal when those who wield it forget that they are merely human beings entrusted with authority that belongs ultimately to the people they serve. Sweet dreams await those who understand that the greatest leaders are those who remember their humanity, even when the world treats them as divine. Let the gentle crackling of our fire carry you into rest, where the shadows of tyranny cannot reach, and where the only empires that matter are those built on justice, compassion, and the recognition that all human beings deserve dignity and respect, regardless of their station in life.